There are also regular-duty and heavy-duty seamers. Use the heavy-duty seamer shown on the left when seaming 22-gauge steel or .040-inch aluminum panels. Use the regular-duty seamer shown on the right when seaming 24-gauge steel or .032-inch aluminum panels. The power seamers are adjusted specifically for the particular thicknesses of aluminum or steel. Fabral recommends seaming each panel as it is installed, instead of installing all the panels and then seaming them later. However, if all the panels are going to be installed before seaming, test the seamer on extra or scrap panels before installing your panels. Then, when installing the panels, clamp the webs of adjacent panels together along their entire length before installing clips. After placing clips, screw them to the substrate. If the webs are not tight together, the seam geometry will be distorted, and the seamer may lift off the seam. Never stretch the panel sideways before it is seamed. If you notice creases in the seam after the power seamer has seamed an area, the creases are probably the result of improper placement of the power seamer and/or incorrect use of hand tool 2. Creases may be caused when the power seamer makes the transition from an area that has the second fold to an area that doesn't have the second fold. This could be the result of making the first and second folds by hand to start the power seamer at the beginning of the panels, but placing the power seamer behind the transition between the first and second folds. Creases may also be caused when the power seamer makes the transition from an area that is being seamed to an area that already has had the second fold made with the hand tool 2. This could be the result of making the second fold with hand tool 2 at the clips and/or at the end of the panel, and then running the power seamer over those areas. Only use hand tool 2 where the power seamer's first 2 sets of wheels will not be moving over the seam. In both distorted seam cases, the seamer was going in the same direction from left to right. Note how the creases are mirror images of each other. Occasionally, the seam may be distorted. Generally, such an area will be just as strong and weather-tight as areas in which the seam is perfect. However, a distorted seam may be aesthetically unacceptable. In such cases, while it is possible to remove the panel, it is often better to repair or cover the seam. First, try to repair the seam with the hand tools and other sheet metal tools. If the seam still is not acceptable, make a small cap as long as required to cover the seam. Place sealant in the cap, then place the cap over the seam. Attach the cap at its ends and in the middle if the cap is long to the seam. If the seamer motor sounds overloaded, check the power supply to make sure it is adequate. Also check to see that the extension cord length and gauge correspond with Fabral's recommendations. This information is in the stand and seam manual and the seaming guide that are included with all power seamers. Occasionally, it may be difficult to engage the power seamer on the prepared seam. If you have trouble depressing the movable handle, look closely at the second shaped wheel and where it is on the seam. Verify that the wheels are opened far enough to fit over the seam. Verify that nothing else is preventing the seamer from setting on the seam. If the problem persists, it may be necessary to lightly rock the seamer from side to side while applying force to the handle to engage the seamer on the seam. The second shaped wheel must go under the first fold for the seamer to work correctly. Stand and seam panels can be installed over fiberglass insulation. Such an installation requires using a clip base pad from Fabral under the clips. If a base pad isn't used with fiberglass insulation, the clip will be pulled into the insulation when the clip screws are installed. This will greatly distort the panel geometry, making seaming almost impossible. To prevent this from occurring, place the pad under the clip as shown. It will compress the insulation at the clip and provide a solid base for the panels. Stand and seam panels can also be installed over rigid insulation. Such an installation requires using a bearing plate between the clip and insulation. If the bearing plate isn't used, the clip will be pulled into the rigid insulation when the clip screws are inserted. This will greatly distort the panel geometry, making seaming almost impossible. Use of the bearing plate prevents this from occurring. The bearing plate is a 24-gauge 6-inch by 6-inch plate. It distributes the load from the clip when it is screwed to the deck. This concludes the instruction in this video. The basic information discussed in this video is included in the Stand and Seam Manual. This information is also included in detail in the Stand and Seam Panel Seaming Guide, which is included with all power seamer shipments. Refer to this guide as you need to. Feel free to keep this guide after you return the seamer. If you have questions about stand and seam panels and/or seaming them, call this number for assistance.